Says Dirshu Mishnah Berurah, Simin Tes Vav, Sif Hey and Vav, as we're going to conclude Simin Tes Vav today, dealing with very prevalent shilas of tzitzis that rip, particularly when they rip in the corner, when the corner over here starts ripping down. We already mentioned this in previous shurim, but now we're going to get to the halacha is what exactly should be done. So let's begin with Sif Hey, but before we begin Sif Hey, let's just point out one halacha that we learned, that the placement of the tzitzis, the placement of this hole is extremely important. We learned that it has to be within 3 fingers. We learned that it has to be, can't be closer, mikasher, agoidel, from your thumb's width, and those are going to be the backbone to today's discussion. So says the Mechaber in Sif Hey, Nikra minekva tzitzis talabai ulamata. If the tzitzis ripped from the hole and downward, from the hole and towards the edge of the bag, if the tzitzis were there, for example, this tzitzis I'm wearing right now are kosher. If right now this were to rip towards the bottom, the tzitzis were there when it ripped, kosher. So once you have kosher tzitzis, and then this hole rips downward, it's okay. And if it rips, and there's still a little bit remaining, and you sewed it back up, and afterwards, hittel by tzitzis, so now it's a different case. Not the case you have a kosher beged. Your beged is in the process of being made. The hole rips. You don't have tzitzis on it yet. Then you sewed it back up, and then you put on the tzitzis. Imushal tzemer kosher l'kuliyama. Imushal shar minim shedach lidvar b'chute shaloisa amin. If you sewed it up with other materials, then it goes back to yesterday's discussion. The machlokes Rashi versus Rav Amram. Loyit for ladas Rashi. According to Rashi, you did the wrong thing, as we explained, because you might mistaken a thread hanging down from one of your tzitzis. If it ripped, and then you sewed it up, and then you put tzitzis on it, then we're not sure what the halacha is. So the Mishnah Berurah now, of course, is going to go and take us case by case, explaining exactly what is going on over here. So says the Mishnah Berurah, Sivkatin Yorchas, this is case number 1, in which it tore after the tzitzis were there. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Mairi, what are we discussing? Bishaloi Tfaroi. We're talking about a case where you do not sew up the talus. Like, again, we're sitting here with tzitzis, and it ripped all the way to the bottom. V'kamash malon da'af out. Kamash malon and da'af al gav deloy nishtayir meloy kesher agadol. Even though it ripped all the way to the corner, and my tzitzis are hanging at this last thread, and it's within the kesher agadol. It's kosher because it only needs while you make it. It's very important. This is a classical case that people think their tzitzis are puzzle and they're really kosher. The tzitzis, often this happens if you're playing ball, which of course you should be wearing your tzitzis, and it gets caught and it rips all the way down. Once it was kosher, if even these tzitzis are hanging all the way at the bottom, within the kasher agoidel, it's still going to be kosher. And now, what do you want to do? Now what you want to do is, you want to sew it up. So, you're wearing a woolen baguette. Sew it up, not with wool, with something else. You don't have to re-put the tzitzis back on. Never became possible. If you're not wearing woolen tzitzis, you're wearing cotton tzitzis. Now it's machlokes Rashi and Rav Amram. You can't sew it up with that material, according to Rashi. You can't use cotton strands. The Shema Yishar B'chut L'Shem Tzitzis, you might leave it over. V'afti Yisham Tzitzis, there's already tzitzis there. So what's the concern? The whole concern, according to Rashi, is that the string might hang down, you might confuse it, but you already have tzitzis. Still, loy plug v'zez loy plug. Elo, what do? Yikach, as we turn over to the next page over there, Yikach, chute min acher, you take a strand to sew it up with a different type of string. V'yoyser toiv shleitz friend b'chalavan, don't sew it up with a white string. Rak b'chut savua colored string. Sheinoigin atalas the tzitzis rak levanim, we make our tzitzis white. V'alkein in ligzer shem yishayim b'chut atfir l'shem tzitzis, and therefore there's no concern that the colored string you're going to think is going to be part of the tzitzis. is going to be part of the tzitzis, and because of this reason, yeah, and that's din number one. So din number one, a very, very relevant din. Your tzitzis that you bought kosher, then they rip, as long as the tzitzis are hanging, the hole could be all the way to the bottom, it's kosher. Sew it back up. Don't use the same material of that which you're sewing with, and sew it up with a colored thread, lichatchila. Dirshu over here quotes a kasha of the Chazon Ish, note number 13. He wants to know, according to our minog, that we make the strands white. That's not the ikar halacha. Therefore, you shouldn't change, and therefore, just an eitzah, says the Chazon Ish, and that's the reason why we have a loy plug. The Chazon Ish was bothered. Why don't we just use color and everything should be good? Okay, let's continue. So din number one is, if the tzitzis started off kosher, they're going to remain kosher and sew it up with a different color and a different type of material than the beg. Says Mishnah Berurah and Sivkotan Yud Tes, quoting the Machaber that says that if the garment is of tzemer, kosher l'kuliyam. We're not worried to leave a plastic nylon string hanging down as tzitzis. There's no concern. And according to Rav Amram, since there's a little bit left, it didn't fully detach. There's no concern. Since you hung on the tzitzis after you sewed it up. Says in the Mishnah Berurah Sivkotan Chaf Lo Yitvar, and the tzitzis are other materials, like we said, like cotton, according to Rashi, don't sew it up. It doesn't mean don't sew it up at all. It means don't sew it up with the same material. Again, we just saw, use a colored thread. Says the Mishnah Berurah Sivkotan Yonalav, and if it ripped, and then you sewed it up, and then you put the tzitzis on it. Ratzalaymar explains the Mishnah Berurah. Shenikra kuloi minekev ad soif hasafa. Very important detail. The Mishnah Berurah quotes from the Magen Avraham, because if the case is difficult to understand what the difference in case 2 and case 3. Says the Mishnah Berurah, case 3 over here is that the hole ripped all the way, ripped out. Again, over here, this hole ripped, it's not hanging by this thread at the end, it ripped all the way through. And therefore, you sewed it up till wait. Remember yesterday's discussion? Remember when the corner ripped off and Rav Amram said, even if you sew back on the corner, it's possible because as if it's not there. So maybe over here when it rips all the way through, the Rav Amram have shit the Rav Amram possible. Kim to share kolshu. Halei mavur, b'sev HaKodim we learned yesterday. Dil das a rishayin command the passing dummy. If it's not there, well, you're allowed to be rafim years later to tzedakah. It doesn't help unless you re-put the tzitzis. Excuse me, if it doesn't help, even if you put tzitzis on afterwards, and that's one reason why it shouldn't work. Says Mishnah Berurah, what everyone's probably wondering. Maybe here it's better. What do you mean? The whole corner yesterday, the whole corner ripped off. Here the corner is here. Just the whole ripped all the way to the edge. Mishnei Sadim, Rak B'em Senifsek, there's a hole in the middle. And that is what the Shulchan Aruch is not sure about. And the Taz argues. Says the Taz, there's no doubt. The kosher, says the Taz, you sewed it up and then you put on the tzitzis, everyone agrees it's kosher. So what's the psak? Umakal Makayim says Mishnah Berurah Yisir Toiv Sheyireh Koydem Atfira L'Seis Tach Zakenav Chaticha Begir Shal 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 V'Yitzadei Akol. Like we said yesterday, what's the psak? To put on this box in the back, to put this piece on, to make sure it's a garment according to everyone. Vimi Yavshalov, it's impossible. Yesh Akol Kataz, you could be Mekel. The Blav Hachel Kasam Nubsif Katan Tezvav Del Das Achronik the Tfir Machshav Chiber Moyel Af Benigur Kaf the Gamrim Kaim, even if it's fully ripped. So part number 2 of this sif is also very relevant. Happens in camps often. The tzitzis rips all the way through the end, and now there's nothing left. So what do? You have to put the strings back on. But how do you have to obviously retie them. But are you allowed to re-sew up the begin and put on the strings? Because it's a rip very close to the corner. Lechatchila, no. Lechatchila, you should take a piece of garment like we have over here and put it on the back. If you can't do that, there's makkah to be makel like the Taz. Continues the Mishnah Berurah, the Machaber and Sevav, regarding the putting the piece of cloth on the corner, like we just said, this piece in the corner over here, which is the minhag, of course, and similar that what do? We sew around the hole as you can see over here, we saw around this hole to reinforce it. If the talus is made of silk, and you sew with a thread of white silk, one second, remember Rashi? Maybe you can have a string hanging down and you're going to get confused. Says the Ramav, if you sew up with the same type of thread, we're concerned that it might be that one might confuse it for the chut of the tzitzis. And of course, all these tzitzis in which are purchased, this thread, I'm not exactly sure of the material, but this is wool, and this thread that's sewn up obviously is cotton or something like that. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah over here, Sivkadot Chav Beis. If the talus is made of meshi, timushal semer. If the talus is made of wool, there's no concern at all. And perhaps this is another reason, another maila, why you would want your tzitzis to be of wool. If the strands are made of silk, again, it's only concerned if it's the same material. There's no concern. We're not worried they're going to take it as tzitzis. Tzitzis only patterned with its own min if it's not wool. Lavan, if it's white, this says the Mishnah Berurah, if the thread is colored, tzitzis is no concern. We don't make colored tzitzis much because of simin tes, sif hey. And finally, in sif katan chaf hey, lamata mekimel. This is the end of the Machaber that says that it's concerned according to Rashi that we don't want you to sew up anything in the corner. So again, if you have these threads on the edges, which is with underneath the Kesher Godel, that is not the issue. Should not sew around the hole with a white string. And of course, that is the reason why this hole is not a concern. Let's for one moment look at Dirshu note number 14. Says the Dirshu that if you sew it up with strands of a different color, we learned before that it's not a problem. Says the Dirshu that what do? You make around the hole with cotton. But even when it's made out of cotton, which of course I'm sure many people wearing cotton begadim know that's what they have on them. And why are they doing that? We just saw you shouldn't do that. So the Beis Baruch explains there's saimech on the Aruch HaShulchan that says since nowadays the tzitzis are wool, there's no concern. A massive Aruch HaShulchan. Let's explain that. We'll call it a day. This is wool. This happens to be wool also. But let's say someone's wearing a cotton baguette. They're going to go look down and say, wait, I'm wearing a cotton baguette, and sewn around this hole is cotton. We just learned the whole sif that you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't have the strings that you sewed up, the same material as the baguette, because we're concerned that one might hang down. Says Aruch HaShulchan nowadays, since everyone makes the tzitzis strings out of wool, don't have to worry about it. Gavaldik will pick it up from Simon Tezayim.